Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope everyone's doing well. This is your host Rocco again. Today we're going to be continuing on and concluding the Holy Trinity, the trilogy of fantastic progressive rock albums released by the Italian prog band Banco Del Mutuo Soccorso, or Banco for short. Now, this album here really just builds and follows upon the two predecessing albums, so if you guys want to get a more detailed analysis of these guys' sound in general, then definitely check out my previous two reviews, because this album here, although it doesn't make any drastic changes, it does have a few changes here and there, and it would just make a little bit more sense to just get an appreciation for their general sound before hearing my review of this album. So I recommend that you watch those first two videos if you guys want, but again, I'll try to make it so that this review kind of suits a first listening perspective as well. So I'll try my best to do that, but it's going to be hard because Banco is just one of those bands that just came right out of the gates with fantastic albums. I mean, their debut album does not sound like a debut album. It's one of those releases by a band, one of those debut releases that really sounds like the band were mature up to this point, that they've been playing together for like 10 years or so, and they just mastered and gelled their sound. So really, this band here didn't have any drastic jumps in quality and composition, especially with these three albums, which were released within like a 1 to 2 year period, 1972, 1973. This one here, I believe, was released in mid to late 73. Correct me if I'm wrong. So really not a huge time frame, just really a point in time in this band's history where the ideas were flowing like milk and honey, and they really could do no wrong. I mean, there was not one bad or even slightly mediocre song across their first three albums. So usually I talk about how a band progresses and changes, but with these three albums, there's minor changes here and there, and this one here does have quite a few changes. But overall, it's meant to be listened to as a trilogy. Like, honestly, just sit your ass down and go on a nice, I guess, hour and a half progressive rock marathon, and you'll thank me later. It's absolutely fantastic. Or now that I think about it, probably about 2 hours. But anyway, so this album here, Io Sono Nato Libero, the third album by Banco, again released in late 1973. And this one here seems to be one of their more well-loved albums, if not the number one album, the number 2 behind Darwin. And, listening to the trilogy back-to-back multiple times to make this kind of mini-series on my channel, this album here is strange for me, because at first, when I first heard it, I didn't like it as much as Darwin, because Darwin is just so crazy and out there, and it's just constantly shifting, constantly changing, and it has this quirky, playful kind of vibe, and it's a concept album. It just really appealed to me the first time I heard it. This album here is a little bit more refined, a little more mature, doesn't really dive off the deep end very often, and it's a little bit slower, a little bit more brooding, a little bit more classical. So at first, it did take me a little longer to get into, plus it didn't have those like huge operatic, passionate moments like Settecentocinquanta Mille Anni Fa, L'Amore on the previous album. I know it's a long song title, and a lot of other moments like that, like Rest in Peace on their debut. It's a little more subtle, takes a few more listens to really get into. But trust me, guys, when I did, this album instantly became my favorite Banco album. And it stayed that way for a while, for about a year. And then I went back and I listened to the trilogy a few more times. And then Darwin went back to being my number one. So basically, those two albums there kept shifting back and forth. And right now, I still think Darwin is my number one album. But this one is a very close second. I mean, the quality is just extremely consistent. And yeah, it's just absolutely fantastic. It's such a great album. If you like progressive rock, you need to hear this. Like, you need to hear all three of these albums. But this one here in particular, it's probably the most refined, the most, what's the word I'm looking for here? The most mature. I think it is their most mature album. It has some amazing songwriting and shows a lot of restraint as well. And there is a lot of like freeform stuff, especially in the first track. But the rest of the album is really feels composed, rather than just the free-form explorations on Darwin and so forth. So in that sense, it's more similar to their debut album. Not that it's more accessible. It's actually not really an accessible album. There is a lot of experimentation, and the melodies do take time to really sink in and internalize. But it's definitely not as crazy as Darwin, is what I'm trying to say. So maybe it's a good starting point after the debut. I recommend starting off with the debut, getting a sense of what this band's all about. That album there is just really accessible. then maybe going into this one and then checking out Darwin after. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking. But yeah, guys, so my history with this album fluctuates a bit, but overall, I love it. Now, in terms of the history section, I always talk about the history behind the bands. There isn't much to say about this one because it did come out shortly after Darwin. Basically, the only difference is these guys hired a few external musicians to add touches here and there, a few extra guitar players, Silvana Aliotta and Bruno Perisota. Sorry if I'm butchering the names. Those are the percussionists. The other guitar player was Rodolfo Maltese, and then those two other people I just mentioned were some extra percussionists they got in, which they really make use on the first song, the 16 minute epic. Some awesome percussion on there, so that's new. But basically, it's the same kind of idea. Vittorio Nocenzi composing most of the music, Francesco Di Giacomo writing the lyrics, and this time it's kind of a concept album. It's a quasi concept album. With some like left wing political leanings, but I'll get more into that with the overall review. But yeah, in terms of the history, no real major developments in the band's lineup between Darwin and this album. Other than those few extra musicians I told you about. But really, this band here just existed at the perfect time. I mean, progressive rock was a huge movement in Italy in 1972, 1973, 1974. So again, if you want more details on that whole movement, check out my previous review and especially the first video in the series from their debut album. And I go more in depth with that. And, ironically, this album here would be their last on their Italian label, Ricordi, because ELP, of all people, would actually pick up on these guys at around this point. Again, how could you not with such fantastic albums, and sign them to their English label, Manticore Records. Then afterwards, they would actually re-record an album called Banco in English, with English lyrics, and basically just a selection of songs from their first 3 albums, and release it. And, guys, I really don't recommend that album. If you want to listen to it, if you really want to hear the English versions, then definitely go ahead, be my guest. But I think the Italian language is such a beautiful musical language that when he sings the stuff in English, it just doesn't sound right to me. And really, ironically, you think that being signed to a major label like that would kind of give these guys the outlet to be even more creative. I mean, being signed to a progressive rock label, really having all the freedom in the world. But really, I find that after this album, their quality did go down a bit. Still some awesome stuff, don't get me wrong. But they just really couldn't keep up just the sheer excellence of these first 3 albums. Which is kind of funny because, being signed to a new label and everything. And I think that once they released that English album, they tried getting a little bit more commercial. Their next album after this, I haven't heard a few of them from the 70s, and I really should because I love this band so much. But I've heard in Un Ultimo Cena, and it's still a very progressive album, don't get me wrong. But just, the songs are a bit shorter. They're a little bit less adventurous than this, a little more on the catchy side. So not one of my absolute favorite albums by them, but still good. So still a lot of great stuff to check out. I don't know if I'll be reviewing it because there's just so many albums to get to, and those albums I consider like kind of tier 2 albums, be good but not absolutely excellent. So I'm not sure if I'm going to review those. But anyway, we'll see what happens. Also, I got to mention their 2019 album, Trans-Siberiana, is absolutely fantastic. If you guys want to check out a review of that, just go back on my channel. I reviewed it about maybe like less than a year ago. But that album just took me by surprise because really after their whole 70s period, Banco really went into pop territory in the 80s. Then in the early 90s, they tried re-recording these early masterpieces for a new audience. And then after that, they really didn't do much. They just played live. And then in 2014, Francesco Di Giacomo passed away. So really after the 70s, just not much from these guys to really get out of. And it was just a shame. But then bam, in 2019, out of nowhere, they regroup. They got the singer of the X Factor in Italy, which is like a singing competition. The winner of that show, Tony D'Alessio, who's a great replacement for Francesco Di Giacomo. And they just released this album. And it took me by surprise. And it was absolutely great. So highly recommend that. Just thought I'd throw that in there because not sure if I'm going to be reviewing those like intermediate albums. So anyway, guys, without further ado, let's dive right into the overall review. Alright, so keeping true to my other reviews, when I review this album, I'm probably just going to be comparing and contrasting it to the other Banco albums. So again, that's what I meant by, really, if you want to get a better sense of what this band's all about, check out my first 2 reviews. because really that's kind of the point of this. It doesn't really make sense to kind of go through the band's overall sound every single album. It makes more sense to kind of compare and contrast what they did differently and how they were progressing. Now, although I said earlier on there weren't like any drastic changes, there are quite a few, and I just want to emphasize those throughout the review, just to give you an idea of the unique flavor of this album in their in that holy trinity. What makes it like awesome? Because again, if every album sounded exactly the same, there would be no point in listening to all three. So just wanted to get that disclaimer out of the way. But needless to say, guys, this album here is an absolute gem, an absolute masterpiece. Like you have to get it if you like progressive rock. You owe it to yourself. And again, really don't let the language barrier kind of affect you guys. Again, Google Translate is your friend. I say that in every review because the lyrics on this album are actually pretty awesome. Unlike Darwin, which was like a full-blown concept album about the theory of evolution, this one here, I wouldn't say it's a concept album, but it does have a lot of left-wing political, or I shouldn't really say left-wing, just anti-war, anti-violence kind of themes running through the tracks, especially the epic title track on side one that's about 16 minutes in length, just absolutely one of their best compositions, and the last track as well, which is about 10 minutes. So really a huge chunk of the album has this anti-war message. So if you like that kind of thing, I think you're really going to like this album. You're really going to like the lyrics. The poetry is fantastic here. So again, just get a good translator or Google Translate for you, and you will enjoy this album just as much as any English spoken album, but with all the musical romanticism of Italian. So I just thought I'd mention that. The middle two songs aren't really like political or anything like that, so that's why it's not really a full-blown concept album. But it does have that theme running through. And it gives it a very serious, very dramatic undertone, whereas, you know, the theory of evolution and everything like that, it has this scientific, quirky kind of vibe to it. This one here is just really like brooding and serious and and passionate, I would say. So if the serious vibe to the lyrics is your thing, I think you're really going to like this album, at least lyrically. Now let's talk about the music on this album. Now I mentioned that this album here really kept the core sound of Banco intact with a few minor changes, and I really want to talk about 3 of those changes. But yeah, overall, you're getting that classic Banco sound. I mean, again, it's Italian prog, so the classical influence is number 1. If you like classical music in your progressive rock, there was no better band to get into than Banco and a lot of the other Italian progressive rock bands. So you got that intact, and really that's coming through with the 2 main composers of the band. Actually, most of it was composed by Vittorio Nocenzi, but his brother Gianni, those 2 guys there on keyboards, organs, pianos, all kinds of things like that, all the keys are really what brings that classical influence into the album. And it's an awesome breath of fresh air in a genre that's just often dominated by the whole guitar sound. It's just refreshing to see piano and organ and that as the lead instrument, at least from my perspective. And I just love how they perfectly incorporate that into their music. And there are some rocking moments as well, but it's definitely more on the classical side. So we still have that intact. We still have the adventurous song structures that where you never know where they're going, and a lot of like multi-part, multi-layered facets to the songs. And again, there was just so much going on. This is complex musicianship from classically trained musicians. Just sounds so professional. Very intricate playing. I mean, these guys were absolute virtuosos. And of course, Francesco Di Giacomo's fantastic operatic voice. I mean, one of my all-time favorite singers. So you have their core sound intact. Now, let's talk about the major differences, or the minor differences, I should say. Number 1, the songwriting on this album. You will notice that the songwriting on this album is, while it retains that adventurous feel, it's a lot less all over the place, per se, compared to Darwin. I mean, the songwriting here really feels like each of these tracks has like one, 2, or 3, or sometimes more main themes that get repeated and reprised throughout the track, and really unifying the whole thing. So although you get some free-form explorations and musical sections here and there, it always seems to return to the main theme of the track. Whereas on Darwin, some of the songs would just wander off into just crazy territory and not really resolve themselves. For example, the opening track, L'Evoluzione, it kind of just ends off with this crazy instrumental section. Never really reprising the initial theme. So this album here definitely feels a little bit more refined, a little bit more composed structurally. So I think that's why a lot of the prog fans really like this album. So a bit less experimental in that sense, but the actual content within the tracks is definitely experimental. So don't get me wrong on that. It feels a little bit more cohesive, a little bit more composed. So if you're a fan of that, I think you're really going to like this album. Now, there's one big exception. The main song in the album, the 15-minute opener, the second half of the track really is a crazy instrumental extravaganza. So that's one big exception to the rule. But most of the other tracks really kind of stay true to the main theme throughout and don't really wander off too far into extremely crazy territory. So that's the first thing I want to mention. Very tight songwriting, very mature and refined songwriting. So that's the first major innovation. Now, the second thing is the bombast on this album. I mentioned on my Darwin review, there were a lot of crazy bombastic sections, often driven by the Hammond organ, just playing these frantic riffs or some crazy guitar riffing going on. On this album here, you get that, but, toned down a lot more. There's a lot less bombast. Really, the tracks here build on these big epic themes, and a lot of them are slow-paced and melodic as well. So, that's a difference between this and Darwin. And again, Darwin had a lot of those moments as well, especially that, that ballad track. But this one here, the main melodies of the tracks are pretty slow paced and melodic compared to Darwin, which just had crazy crazy organ and shit like that. I noticed there's a bit less organ on this album too. It's mostly classical piano and synth, which brings me to my next point. The integration between the synth and the classical piano playing is top notch on this album. On Darwin and the album before, just on Darwin, because that was the first album where they had synth. When the synth came in, it really took over. But on this album here, it's just perfectly incorporated with the classical influence stuff. And it just shows that, with Darwin, maybe they first discovered synths and they just went a little trigger happy with that shit. But on this album here, they really figured out how to incorporate that into their sound just to create textures here and there. And again, it does dominate at points, but much less than on Darwin. And the classical piano playing is definitely at an all-time high on this album compared to Darwin. So again, something a little bit more in common with their debut. And it's just absolutely wonderful classical playing. So it definitely has that going for it. A few other minor things I should mention is that I find that this album makes a lot more use of the acoustic guitar, especially with that main song and then Mi Rompete, which is kind of like a poppy kind of ballad, a really accessible tune on the album. So a lot more acoustic playing than the first one. And also not very much clarinet, which gave Darwin and the album before that this like not classical, but this traditional Italian feel. You don't really get any of that here. So musically speaking, it isn't very Italian, except for the classical influence, obviously. So that's just a few different things I noticed about it. Another thing I noticed about it in terms of the guitar playing, since we're on that subject here, is that there's a lot less atonal kind of guitar playing on here. What I mean by atonal is just kind of like this guitar pattern that doesn't really follow a melody. It's just kind of there in the background, sometimes jarring with the piano playing. And they really made good use of that on Darwin. This album here does have some of that, but again, toned down a notch. So I feel like they're not really overusing those motifs that they employed on Darwin to the max. And again, it could sound a bit less exciting for that reason, but I think that gives it an overall more rounded and more accessible kind of listening experience. And again, the opening song is an exception. It does get into some pretty jarring sections there, but really only for a 6-minute section of the whole album, which doesn't, if you think about it, doesn't really take up much. I keep thinking of these differences now. Now that I think about it, Francesco Di Giacomo, his vocal performance is also kind of toned down here. Still fantastic, emotional, operatic, but I feel like there's some moments on Darwin where he's just giving it his all and he's just singing from his guts and everything. On this album here, it's a little bit less overwhelming. So if you weren't a fan of the overly dramatic operatic vocals and you like something more in the mid-range, like still operatic, but not like crazy over-the-top drama, then I think you'll like this album a little bit better as well. So yeah, that's basically the main thing. Overall, this album has just absolutely awesome compositions. The main melodies of the tracks are just so memorable, and the playing is just superb. I mean, everyone in the band is just excellent on here. Again, those extra percussionists they brought in, fantastic playing on the opening song, just excellent. Nothing like we've heard from Banco so far. So that's another major difference there. And some really strong melodies, really powerful as well. It feels like when you listen to this album, it just really pumps you up and gets you motivational and emotional. And it's just a really serious, really intense listening experience. But one that I think that, you'll come back to more and more as time goes on. And you'll appreciate more of the nuances behind it. Because it isn't as in-your-face and bombastic as Darwin. So I think that's really the best way to describe the overall sound of this album. Now, without further ado, let's get into the track-by-track discussions. opening up this album, we get an absolutely phenomenal song. The epic, the 16-minute long Canto Nomade por un Prigioniero Politico, which basically means the chant of the political prisoner. And this song here is just widely regarded. I think it's widely regarded to be their best song, and not just on the album, their entire discography. And although I disagree, it's not my absolute favorite. It's probably in my top 3. It's just such an excellent song, such an epic way to open up the album, and just such a fucking amazing track. I mean, this song here, I gotta be honest, guys, it took me a long time to get into. Not to get into in terms of liking it, I liked it right off the bat, but in terms of really internalizing all that goes on this track, because it really is a tale of two halves. The first 6 minutes of the song are just, well, actually, there's a lot of instrumentation there too, but it's really this epic, larger-than-life, emotional, passionate melody with Francesco Di Giacomo just singing his heart out. And the last, I'd say about the last 9 minutes of the song are just this epic, crazy instrumental extravaganza driven by acoustic guitar, tribal percussion sections, and just some really crazy stuff there. And the vocals never come back. It's really just that section, that first 6 minutes, and then it dives right off the deep end. And this is some of the most interesting, creative music you'll ever hear from Banco. Again, the first 6 minutes, very classical inspired. We'll get more into the details after. But the last half, very loose, very free-form, very jazzy. Which, again, I mentioned this song was an exception to the kind of tight songwriting on this album. That last 6-7 minutes of the song is really loose. So I kind of feel like they got that out of their system in that last 7 minutes, and then they just decided to make the rest of the album very tight. But such an awesome song. As always, I'm going to walk you guys through the highlights of the song, really highlighting some awesome sections here. It starts off classic Banco, beautiful piano, classical melody with these sparse synths just going through. Kind of sounds like a trumpet, and I love that. This is a perfect example of how the synth just perfectly incorporates with the classical piano playing, whereas on previous albums, it kind of felt a bit jarring at points and kind of taken over the sound. But here it's perfect. And then Francesco Di Giacomo comes in with the vocals, and it's absolutely beautiful, and it's so melodic. The theme is just so memorable with the two pianos playing at the same time, and it just builds, and it's just this beautiful operatic classical piece. Then before you know it, at the 2-minute mark, the drums kick in, and it kicks into this pretty cool groove, and the guitar cuts through and the synth cuts through, but again, integrating with the classical piano just perfectly. Then it gets into this cool upbeat section, which is frantic, but again, whereas the frantic sections on Darwin were just really bombastic and inaccessible, this one here you can really get into. It sounds epic sounding, and there's some vocals that match that, very frantic vocals. But again, really cool section there, and very accessible. And the intensity builds, and then we get this weird kind of synthesizer section where this is one of the points on the album where the synth actually takes over. And really, there's barely any other instruments. It might be a bit overbearing to some people, but again, on Darwin, you would get these moments every 2 seconds. So it's a welcome addition every few seconds. Then we get into this beautiful classical acoustic guitar section, and again, very classical inspired. Whereas the guitar on the first album was more avant-garde and atonal. And then Francesco Di Giacomo comes in with the main theme of the track. And it's absolutely awesome. And I should mention, this song is basically about, they use political prisoners as a metaphor for the stifling of the free thinker, the suppression, the oppression that, governments and things put on anyone with new ideas and any radical opinions and things. And the lyrics, you guys just got to read them. I'm not going to go in depth. They're just so beautiful, so metaphorical, and I absolutely love it. And Francesco Di Giacomo just gives a fantastic performance. Again, not going overboard with the emotion and the passion, just perfectly fitting. But this part here, after the acoustic section, he really, really gets passionate. When he sings, Io sono nato libero, which of course is the title of the album, so kind of like the title track. It just sends shivers up and down your spine. One of the great moments in this band's history. And the classical piano just washing over you during that section. So motivational. And again, we've been through so much, and we're only about 6 minutes through the track. Then at the 6-minute, 38-second mark, the whole song kind of comes to a halt. And this is where the craziness begins. We wind down into this nightmarish section with these wind sounds kind of creeping up in the background, this droning synthesizer, and the synth comes in at 7:30, and this getting into this absolutely crazy, frantic piano section that it's just a really sharp transition from what was coming in before, especially after that weird, ominous, atmospheric section we just got into. The piano just cuts in like bam, ding, 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 bam, ding, ding. And it's like, whoa, the first time you hear that, you're like, you're not expecting this. And it has this jazzy flair. Again, it's really, really frantic. And then we get an organ solo playing over that with this groove underneath. It really feels like anxiety. The anxiety on this section is at an all-time high. Honestly, when I hear this song, like, I start sweating at this part. It's just crazy. And you get some jazzy flourishes here and there. Again, bringing that jazz influence in there that they kind of peppered throughout their albums. Very, very frantic. And again, I mentioned the organ solo there. Just an overall crazy section. Definitely probably the most avant-garde section on the album. Like something like that would have been off Darwin, but kind of like in that vein. And now after that section there, you have no idea where the fuck this song is going because it's just taking you places, guys. And at the 9-minute 20-second mark or around there, we get another amazing transition where these crazy guitars kick in, these acoustic guitars of all things. Sounds like a league of guitar players just coming in with their acoustics, just all strumming at the same time, giving it just so much force, so much energy. And then you get this crazy percussion in the background with that guitar cutting through. It's just an acoustic guitar at that. Like usually we think of electric guitars having this power and this energy. But no, this is fucking acoustic, guys. And I really think this is where that extra acoustic guitar player really helped out Marcello Todaro. Give that extra oomph, that extra power that the song really needed. And yeah, the rest of the song really alternates between this acoustic guitar section and crazy tribal drumming. At the 10-minute mark, we get into this percussion section, which is absolutely awesome. So you still get the sharp guitar cutting through the mix, but eventually that subsides and relaxes a bit. And then we get into a full-on, beautiful acoustic guitar solo, which is actually really memorable, and it's fantastic, beautiful acoustic playing. And again, coming after that tribal drum section we just heard, it really leaves you wondering where this song is going in the best possible way. The first time you hear it, it's going to be jarring. It's going to be disorienting. But with multiple listens, when you expect it, it's beautiful. It hits the spot. And following that acoustic guitar passage, we get another tribal drumming session, or tribal percussion section. This one here is a little bit more in-depth. It really takes its time to develop, and it feels like more and more percussion is joining as it progresses. And now here's what I love about this part. The synthesizer comes in, and I don't know how they're getting this fucking sound out of the synthesizer, but it sounds like a percussion instrument, but it's synthesizer. And it just comes in, and it kind of has this like squeaky, weird feel. Again, weird sound. I haven't heard anything like it. These guys were just pushing the envelope, and it just mixes perfectly with with that synthesizer. Then we get the classical guitar section again. So again, really this part of the song is really alternating between those two things. Then before you know it, I think at around the 14-minute mark or so, we get that crazy piano transition again, that really sharp, jarring piano section I was talking about, with the crazy organ solo and the synthesizer. And it's just as frantic and intense as earlier with that anxiety-ridden section. And the synth kind of sounds like a flute at points here. Just a really bombastic way to end the song. Again, this song's an exception. It does get into some pretty bombastic territory here. And the song just kind of ends. And that's my one criticism with the track. The way the song ends, I feel like it could have ended on a more epic note. Maybe bring back the vocals, reprise that section, make it like an 18-minute track instead of 16 minutes. I would have definitely have taken that extra 2-minute reprise of the first part of the song over like the abrupt ending, but I still like it nonetheless. So anyway, guys, that is the first track. I wanted to go a bit more in depth with this one because it has so many highlights, and I hope that my analysis just really helps you guide through it, because it was hard to get into for me. Like, so much goes on, and it just feels like a mess at points. But trust me, once you internalize it, this is going to be an awesome song. Honestly, what else can I give but a 10 out of 10? It's just one of my personal favorites, and a beautiful song in every sense of the word. Closing out side one of the album, we get track 2, a song that is just couldn't be any further from track 1, Non Mi Rompete, which means don't bust my ass, basically. And this one here is just a soft acoustic melodic ballad, and it's such a catchy track. And if you guys listen to this shit on Spotify, you'll notice that this is probably the most listen to song by Banco, and I can definitely see why. It definitely has that catchy vibe to it. Really, really accessible. Nothing really hard to really get into with this track. It's just such a feel good song. And at first, I thought it was kind of a throwaway track, but over time, it's just really ingrained itself into me, and it's just one of the most relaxing tracks ever. Just starts off with this very peaceful acoustic guitar opening, and we get Francesco Di Giacomo singing the softest vocals of his entire career so far. Again, not going over the top, not going melodramatic, just perfectly perfectly fitting the tone of the track, which is basically all about, just enjoying a peaceful sleep. Again, it's a really mundane kind of thing to be singing about, but in the right mindset, it's just so relaxing. And I love the lyrics, how they talk about, don't bother me, whether it be like a baby, childlike sleep or a drunken stupor. You can enjoy a nice evening of relaxation every once in a while. And that's just a really cool aspect of the song. Now, the one thing I didn't get into at first was the kind of scat singing, if you want to put it that way. Kind of like the chorus of the track where Francesco Di Giacomo is just singing la 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 la, and the acoustic guitar kind of intensifies during that section there, which is pretty cool. And I thought that was kind of cheesy and kind of poppy, in my opinion, at first. But over time, it's just ingrained itself in me, and again, it's just so catchy. Such a feel-good moment on the album. And again, on an album that's so serious, you need like a little bit of a feel-good track like this. And then at the end of the track, the synthesizer comes in and creates this really jovial, uplifting kind of vibe. So amazing song. Easy to see why it was a big hit for these guys. And a nice kind of break between like the epic seriousness of the rest of the tracks on this album. So definitely like this song a lot. I would easily give it an 8.5 to a 9 out of 10, somewhere in that range. Alright guys, so the next song here is called La Citta Sottile, which basically means the thin city, or like the fragile city, I guess. I don't know, I'm drawing on my Italian heritage here for some translation. But I think it means the thin city. But again, I could be wrong. Anyway, this track here just perfectly exemplifies what I was talking about earlier on when I said that this band really had a tighter songwriting approach to this album. Again, the song that came before it, Non Mi Rompete, was a perfect example of that as well. I just didn't really highlight it. But this track here just really stays kind of in the same theme, in the same place, for the majority of its runtime. There's a good 2-minute section in the middle that kind of wanders off into different territory. But for the most part, this song here is just a really ominous, brooding kind of track. And don't ask me what the lyrics are about. I saw the English translation. It's basically describing this city, using a lot of really poetic literature going on here. So really interesting lyrics. I just don't know what they were getting at, what the whole theme of the track was, what the deeper meaning is. I'm sure there is a deeper meaning, considering this album is very deep lyrically, but I just don't know what it is. So if you guys can find out, comment below and let me know, because I'm not too sure. But musically, it's a really brooding track. It opens up with this very ominous piano section, and even like a few touches of percussion, kind of drawing influence on or drawing from the first track there. But yeah, really nice. And then it just suddenly develops into this beautiful melody, and it really takes a lot of amazing musicianship just to totally change the whole atmosphere and sound of the track, because it starts off very ominous, but then all of a sudden we get into this beautiful uplifting melody, and it's perfect. But again, before we know it, we get back into that brooding melody, and Francesco Di Giacomo's vocals really suit that. Again, he sounds very mournful, very not really as operatic as he usually does, but gives it a lot of that ominous, haunting kind of vibe there. And then it builds a bit, and it swells. His vocals really swell at some points. And then the guitar comes in, adding a little bit of color here and there. Again, the guitar isn't really a main instrument on this song. But and by guitar, I mean electric, because again, the first few tracks have been very acoustic driven. This one here, the electric guitar comes in, and it isn't very atonal. It's pretty straightforward. It's just kind of thing going on. So nothing too exciting. And the second verse of the track is really cool as well. We got the organ joining in, giving it that extra oomph there. But again, very laid back, melancholic kind of tune. But yeah, stays in the same kind of vein for 4 minutes. So again, this was the band just really kind of locking into a groove and staying into it. And there's some great bass playing in the track as well, especially with the section that goes do 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 do. That part there is really cool, especially with the bass giving it that backdrop there. Really cool section. But then at the 4 minute mark, we get an abrupt change. The song kind of just winds down, and we get this piano coming in, and then this Christmas sounding synthesizer coming in. It sounds absolutely Christmassy. I don't know how else to describe it. But that comes in, and then it winds down, and we get this spoken word section. So not sure how you guys feel about spoken word. I think it suits the track. It suits like the ominous nature of the song. But it might feel a little bit, I don't know, theater-ish, like a little bit over melodramatic for you guys. And I would definitely like sympathize with that opinion. But again, I find it suits the song. But if you don't, I guess it's kind of a, my word against yours. We'll agree to disagree kind of thing. Because really, you can criticize it for being a little bit overly dramatic. But I tend to like it. But anyway, pretty cool section there. Piano and synthesizer really driving it. Really kind of spacey and out there. But then before you know it, at the 6 minute mark, the main piano theme comes back in. And you get that great release from the tension that spoken word section built up to. And then it gets back into the main melody and it kind of ends. So great track. Really a song that stays in this ominous, melancholic vein. And really cool as well. Great playing on the piano. And again, I love how they just changed the whole atmosphere of the song at the drop of a hat. Takes a lot of fantastic instrumentation to do that. So for that reason alone, I'm going to give this track a 9 out of 10. Very strong song. I absolutely love this next track, guys. Dopo, Niente e più lo stesso, which means and then nothing was the same. This track here is an absolute epic. 10 minutes in length, so a bit shorter than the first track there, but no less fucking epic. It's basically another anti-war track describing this soldier coming back from the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. And I really think the song has to do with PTSD as well. But it's really about, all the struggles a veteran has to endure when coming back from war. The whole world changed. Nothing's the same. Society is completely different. And that could take a real toll on you as a person. And this song's just gets into so many different emotions. We get triumphant climaxes. We get depressing, laid-back sections. Some absolutely insane sections which show kind of like the mental struggles that the protagonist of the track is going through. It's an absolute masterpiece. Really, like one of the best songs I ever heard in my life. And I don't say that lightly. Man, I feel like Banco is probably the most underrated band ever. I mean, just listen to this song. And again, at first, the song does go through a lot of changes, but I feel like it never really wanders off into avant-garde kind of free-form territory. Every section of the song has purpose, and usually there's a strong, epic kind of heaviness to most of the sections of the song that give it that memorability factor, that sense that every part of the song has a purpose, and you're not just listening to like free-form crap like what was going on Darwin. And again, I love fucking Darwin. I like Darwin even better than this album, but it's just a different kind of facet to Banco's rich musical history. That's a little bit more composed. And this song here just goes through so many highlights. Again, the first 4 minutes of the track are a lot different than the last 6 minutes, but really every single millisecond of this track is awesome. So I guess let's just walk through some of the highlights. I mentioned it's a heavy track, but you wouldn't think that because it starts off with this playful synthesizer riff, this and you really don't know where the song's going to go, but then you start hearing other instruments coming in, and it starts to get into this dramatic build-up, and then before you know it, these big, heavy piano chords come in, and the song actually gets really intense. Francesco Di Giacomo's vocals are tension-laden and intense without going over the top into his like crazy operatic range, but this awesome drive to this part of the song. Excellent like sense of tension building. Really shows and this part of the song here describes the soldier actually coming back, riding on this train through the countryside, coming back to his home. And you could just feel the anxiety that he has as he approaches, the land of his birth. So the song's off to a fantastic start. But then at the 2 minute mark, we get arguably my favorite section of the whole track. This part here is just absolutely incredible, guys. I mean, it took me a while to realize how amazing this part is, but it's absolutely ethereal. Like, it's beautiful, it's delicate, and it's just so emotional. At the 2 minute mark, the song completely winds down and becomes very ominous and dark with the piano playing. It lightens up a bit, but transitions into this delicate synth section, and then Francesco Di Giacomo's vocals come in, and he sounds so sorrowful, so mournful, but again, there's this delicate kind of vulnerability to his voice that's absolutely beautiful. And then we get into this amazing piano, classical piano section, some of Vittorio Nocenzi's best piano playing, such a strong melody, a fantastic melody that really, it doesn't really get reprised later on in the track, but for a moment there, you're in heaven. It's just absolutely dreamlike. And I think this part of the song here really describes, the soldier kind of fantasizing about what the world's going to be when he gets back to it, what his homeland's going to be. And at least in my opinion. Then at around the 4 minute mark, the song completely changes again, and really the next 6 minutes of the track are just right back into the heaviness, but a little bit more of this epic and grandiose feel to this section, because it comes in with this triumphant synth riff. And I also should have mentioned during that classical section, there were touches of synth there really driving the track, but again, perfectly incorporated with the classical piano. So that's another thing that this album did so well. But now we get into this triumphant synth riff, and it's just absolutely epic, just cutting through the mix with this. I love that. It's just so triumphant, so memorable, and a great release from the tension that classical ominous section really built up to. It absolutely explodes. It gets heavy. Francesco Di Giacomo comes in with this very, I don't know, it sounds like he's making an announcement, like a proclamation kind of sound to his voice, if that makes any sense. Larger than life shit right here, grandiose, gets really heavy. The electric guitar kicks in again, adding this nice kind of backdrop, this heavy kind of backdrop going there, really bringing the rock in. Then we get some awesome bass lines. There's this cool bass line dominating here with a absolutely frantic guitar riff. It's absolutely dramatic. Then another big change. The song completely changes to this harpsichord-driven section. And again, these transitions might be jarring at first, but trust me, guys, they'll sink in. You'll love it. And we get some spoken word from Francesco Di Giacomo. And this part here is really what I call the mad section of the song, like where I think the title, I was going to say the title track, the protagonist of the track starts going crazy, starts losing his mind. And there's kind of like this weird, insane tone to Francesco Di Giacomo's spoken word on this part. Really weird. And with the harpsichord in the background, it just sounds really out of place, but that adds to the insane effect of the song. But then before you know, we get a reprise of that triumphant synthesizer riff coming in, and just a reprise of that epic bass line and that melody there. So again, this song isn't freeform, it's structured. They have the reprises going through the song. And that's a great tension and release section right there, especially after that insanity. That might be a bit hard to get into. I know a lot of people don't like spoken word stuff, but Francesco Di Giacomo gives it that flair, gives it that passion. It's just awesome. And the song kind of ends the way it started with that playful synth riff, but here it sounds a little bit darker, and it really goes to show how they could take this playful synthesizer riff and just completely change it into something heavy and dark at the end of the song. So for me, guys, an absolute masterpiece. This song's really got it all. Just so many emotions. I mean, it's such an emotional, triumphant, epic, and even sorrowful song at points here. So I got to give it a 10 out of 10. There's no other score I could possibly give it. Definitely one of the best Banco songs. Okay, guys, so now closing out the album, we get a song called Traccia II, basically meaning track 2. And I bet you guys are wondering, like, what the fuck does that mean? I mean, this is the fifth and last song on the album. But really, it's a reference to an earlier Banco song, the song that closed out their debut album, which was called Traccia, or just Track. So this is kind of like the sequel to that. And it's pretty similar. It's just this classical kind of fanfare sounding, kind of regal sounding, epic closing to the album. Really this nice melodic piano riff that later evolves into the synthesizer section. Just this cool kind of classical build-up there, or like a fanfare. It's a nice way to close the album. Again, it's just a short 2-minute track. I really got nothing else to say about it. It's just this nice kind of classical way to end the album. Just a nice closer. And I don't know, it doesn't really sound like Traccia 1 or just Traccia, which had a lot of those insane operatic vocals with the la 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 la, something like that. But yeah, pretty cool track. literally. And yeah, guys, I mean, I think that's all I gotta say about the album. I mean, honestly, don't even hesitate. You guys gotta go out and get this album. It's amazing. Again, I just want to emphasize it's not as in your face, it's not as out there as Darwin. So, for people that like free form, crazy shit like me, it might take a little bit longer to get into. It isn't as immediate. Again, there's a lot of brooding sections on the album, a lot of dark sections, like the whole La Citta Sottile is a very dark song. The song I just talked about, Dopo, Niente, Stesso, has a lot of heavy sections to it. And the title track, too, as well, has that, crazy percussion and acoustic guitar driven section at the end there, which definitely takes a while to get into. So don't give up if you don't immediately get into it. But I feel that fans that like more conventional progressive rock are going to like this a little bit better than Darwin because it doesn't really have those crazy free form sections. So really it's just a matter of preference. Again, it's like a he said, she said kind of thing. Like your word against mine. It's really just a matter of personal preference. But in terms of songwriting, I gotta say this album here is probably the greatest of Banco's discography in terms of like the tight compositional songwriting skills. It's fucking awesome. So honestly, guys, another progressive rock masterpiece. Hopefully, I'll be reviewing some more Banco albums in the future. I don't know. We'll see because again, they aren't like the greatest albums ever. And I have other things I'm more passionate about that I want to review. But who knows? Stay tuned. There's definitely going to be more Italian reviews. There's so many fantastic Italian albums I'm dying to talk about. Again, Museo Rosenbach's Zarathustra, or however the fuck you say it. I've been listening to that shit nonstop. So, a month from now when that album fully absorbs in, I might make a review of it because it's so great. But until then, guys, thank you so much for watching. Peace out and rock on.